Okay, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Milton Friedman, and this was written in 1970. Milton Friedman, you may know, is, or was, I think he's dead now, a famous economist. Okay, introduction. When I hear businessmen speak eloquently about the quote-unquote social responsibilities of business in a free enterprise system, I am reminded of the wonderful line about the Frenchman who discovered at the age of 70 that he had been speaking prose all his life. The businessmen believe that they are defending free enterprise when they declaim that business is not concerned merely with profit, but also with promoting desirable social ends, that business has a social conscience and takes seriously its responsibilities for providing employment, eliminating discrimination, avoiding pollution, and whatever else may be the catchwords of the contemporary crop of reformers. In fact, they are, or would be if they or anyone else took them seriously, preaching pure and unadulterated socialism. Businessmen who talk this way are unwitting puppets of the intellectual forces that have been undermining the basis of a free society these past decades. The discussions of the social responsibilities of business are notable for their analytical looseness and lack of rigor. What does it mean to say that business has responsibilities? Only people can have responsibilities. A corporation is an artificial person, and in this sense may have artificial responsibilities, but business as a whole cannot be said to have responsibilities, even in this vague sense. The first step toward clarity in examining the doctrine of social responsibility of business is to ask precisely what it implies for whom. Okay, so all that was, we might say, the intro of the introductory section. Now we're going to get more into the content of what Friedman wants to say. So presumably the individuals who are to be responsible are businessmen, which means individual proprietors or corporate executives. Most of the discussion of social responsibility is directed at corporations. So in what follows, I shall mostly neglect the individual proprietor and speak of corporate executives. Okay, do I have this? Okay, I've got some definitions here. All right, so just what he was saying, corporate executive, when he says businessman, and this is written in 1970, so everything is about man or men in Friedman's language, but in any case, when he says businessman, Friedman primarily means the individual who runs a business that is owned by shareholders or stockholders. So, for instance, the chief executive officer. In a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has a direct responsibility to his employers. Okay, so when a company is public, that is, the shares of the company are publicly traded, then the owners of the company are the shareholders or the stockholders. So in that sense, we might think of the CEO as being, in charge, but what Friedman is pointing out here is that the CEO and any of the other top-level executives are working for the owners, that is, working for the shareholders. So he or she has a direct responsibility to his employers, that is, the shareholders. That responsibility is to conduct business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. Okay, so this is an important sentence, more or less the thesis of the whole article. And I'll just point out right now, okay, so make as much money as possible, that part's clear. Follow the law, that part's clear. And also the basic rules or guidelines of society that are embodied in ethical custom. What Friedman means by that exactly isn't entirely clear. If it's ethical or moral to not discriminate or eliminate discrimination or take steps to prevent discrimination, if it's moral to avoid polluting or avoid emitting more carbon than is necessary, then it would seem executives have a responsibility to do those things as well, although that's clearly not in other places what Friedman has in mind. So this embodied in ethical custom has always been a little confusing. But in any case, that's the thesis of the article. Of course, in some cases, his employers may have a different objective. A group of persons might establish a corporation for a eleemosynary. I think that's how you say it. It's not a very common word anymore. Eleemosynary pertaining to charity. Okay, may establish a corporation for an eleemosynary or charitable purpose, for example, a hospital or a school. The manager of such a corporation will not have money profit as his objective, but the rendering of certain services. In either case, the key point is that in his capacity as a corporate executive, the manager is the agent of the individuals who own the corporation or establish the eleemosynary institution, and his primary responsibility is to them. Okay, agent and principal. Principal. Okay, so in this sense, the principal is someone acting on his or her own behalf. So that would be the owner of an enterprise. This is in contrast to an agent who acts on behalf of someone else. So in this context here, the executive is the agent, the owners of the company, the shareholders are the principals. Needless to say, this does not mean that it is easy to judge how well he is performing his task, but at least the criterion of performance is straightforward, and the persons among whom a voluntary contractual agreement exists are clearly defined. Of course, the corporate executive is also a person in his own right. As a person, he may have other responsibilities that he recognizes or assumes voluntarily to his family, his conscience, his feelings of charity, his church, his clubs, his city, his country. He may feel impelled by these responsibilities to devote part of his income to causes he regards as worthy, to refuse to work for particular corporations, even to leave his job, for example, to join his country's armed forces. If we wish, we may refer to some of these responsibilities as social responsibilities, but in these respects, he is acting as a principal, not an agent. He is spending his own money or time or energy, not the money of his employers or the time or energy he has contracted to devote to their purposes. If these are social responsibilities, they are the social responsibilities of individuals, not business. Okay, section 2. What does it mean to say that the corporate executive has a social responsibility in his capacity as a businessman? If the statement is not pure rhetoric, it must mean that he is to act in some way that is not in the interest of his employers. For example, that he is to refrain from increasing the price of the product in order to contribute to the social objective of preventing inflation, even though a price increase would be in the best interests of the corporation, or that he is to make expenditures on reducing pollution beyond the amount that is in the best interests of the corporation, or that is required by law in order to contribute to the social objective of improving the environment, or that at the expense of corporate profits, he is to hire hardcore unemployed instead of better qualified available workmen to contribute to the social objective of reducing poverty. Okay, so in these examples here, one thing to note is that Friedman talks a lot about inflation, which has not been a problem. So this, of course, was written in the 1970s, and inflation has not been a problem since the early 1980s, so it's not something we even really think too much about, and it's not something that we would necessarily put in the category of moral issues, like reducing pollution or reducing carbon emissions or hiring people who maybe have a criminal record or have only a GED or something like that. But nonetheless, in the early 1970s, in 1970, inflation was a big issue. And so Friedman talks about it a lot in this article. In some ways, it might help him make the case better for what he's trying to say. But when he does talk about it, probably the best thing to do is just to substitute what he says about pollution and substitute what he says about inflation and just think about reducing pollution or trying to limit carbon emissions or something like that. Okay, top of page 2, column 2. In each of these cases, the corporate executive would be spending someone else's money for a general social interest. Insofar as his actions, in accord with his social responsibility, reduce returns to stockholders, he is spending their money. Insofar as his actions raise the price to customers, he is spending the customers' money. Insofar as his actions lower the wage of some employees, he is spending their money. The stockholder or the customers or the employees could separately spend their own money on the particular action if they wish to do so. The executive is exercising a distinct social responsibility rather than serving as the agent of the stockholders or the customers or the employees, only if he spends the money in a different way than they would have spent it. Okay, so you can note that I've made a note here in the margin that this and over here, he is to act in some way that is not in the interest of his employers. They're not perfect definitions, but they're basically what we get as definitions of acting on a social responsibility. And then these, of course, would be examples. Okay, but if he does this, he is in effect imposing taxes on the one hand and deciding how the tax proceeds shall be spent on the other. All right, so this is going to be important for the rest of this page and the next page. So let's look at this. So acting on a social responsibility, for instance, not polluting when it is legal to do so, makes profits and wages lower or prices higher, and so shareholders and employees get less money or customers pay more. That is assuming that not polluting entails some additional costs, or going above and beyond what's required by law presumably is going to entail some additional costs. Okay, and then what this sentence right here means is the shareholders or employees or customers pay the cost of acting on the social responsibility insofar as just what I said up here. Okay, so that's the tax. That's the way in which shareholders, employees, and customers are being taxed in the way that Friedman is talking. And the executive acts on the social responsibility. That's spending the proceeds of the tax. Okay, so the order is backwards. In this scenario here, the executive is going to act on the social responsibility, take extra steps to limit pollution or whatever it might be, and then that's going to have these effects. So the action comes first and then the tax comes second, but in any case, that's the basic idea. Okay, 2.1, on the level of political principle. This process raises political questions on two levels, principle and consequences. Okay, so let me point out to you right now, Friedman is going to talk about the political principle that's at issue here, and then on the next page, he's going to talk about the political consequences. And the reason why he's framing this now as a political issue is because in this way of characterizing things here, the executive is taxing and spending. Okay, so on the level of political principle, the imposition of taxes and the expenditure of tax proceeds are governmental functions. We have established elaborate constitutional, parliamentary, and judicial provisions to control these functions, to assure that taxes are imposed so far as possible, in accordance with the preferences and desires of the public. After all, taxation without representation was one of the battle cries of the American Revolution. We have a system of checks and balances to separate the legislative function of imposing taxes and enacting expenditures from the executive function of collecting taxes and administering expenditure programs, and from the judicial function of mediating disputes and interpreting the law. Here, the businessman, self-selected or appointed directly or indirectly by stockholders, is to be simultaneously legislator, executive, and jurist. He is to decide whom to tax, by how much, and for what purpose, and he is to spend the proceeds. All this guided only by general extortions from on high to restrain inflation, improve the environment, fight poverty, and so on and on. The whole justification for permitting the corporate executive to be selected by the stockholders is that the executive is an agent serving the interests of his principal. This justification disappears when the corporate executive imposes taxes and spends the proceeds for social purposes. He becomes, in effect, a public employee, a civil servant, even though he remains in name an employee of private enterprise. On grounds of political principle, it is intolerable that such civil servants, insofar as their actions in the name of social responsibility are real and not just window dressing, should be selected as they are now. Okay, so such civil servants, that's referring to executives who act on social responsibilities. If they are to be civil servants, then they must be selected through a political process. if they are to impose taxes and make expenditures to foster social objectives, then political machinery must be set up to guide the assessment of taxes and to determine through a political process the objectives to be served. This is the basic reason why the doctrine of social responsibility involves the acceptance of the socialist view that political mechanisms, not market mechanisms, are the appropriate way to determine the allocation of scarce resources to alternative uses. Okay, so there's a lot in this subsection. The important thing to keep in mind is that Friedman has made this point here at the end of at the end of this first part of section 2. And what he's talking about with taxing and spending is what I said about what's going on here. And then in 2.1, he's just kind of elaborating on what he sees as the implications of this. Okay, 2.2, on the level of political consequences. On the ground of consequences, can the corporate executive in fact discharge his alleged social responsibilities? On the one hand, suppose he could get away with spending the stockholders' or customers' or employees' money. How is he to know how to spend it? He is told that he must contribute to fighting inflation. How is he to know what action of his will contribute to that end? He is presumably an expert in running his company, in producing a product or selling it, or financing it, but nothing about his selection makes him an expert on inflation. Okay, again, inflation may not be the best example here. Inflation is tricky, and it's not really something that one executive acting on his or her own can really solve. So in that sense, Friedman is surely right that an executive shouldn't try to lower inflation on their own. Will his holding down the price of his product reduce inflationary pressure, or by leaving more spending power in the hands of his customers, simply divert it elsewhere? Or by forcing him to produce less because of the lower price, will it simply contribute to shortages? Even if he could answer these questions, how much cost is he justified in imposing on his stockholders, customers, and employees for this social purpose? What is his appropriate share, and what is the appropriate share of others? Okay, so these two paragraphs here that I have, not circled, but rectangled, are interesting. So this one first, and whether he wants to or not, can he get away with spending his stockholders, customers, or employees' money? Will not the stockholders fire him, either the present ones or those who take over, when his actions in the name of social responsibility have reduced the corporation's profits and the price of its stock? His customers and his employees can desert him for other producers and employers less scrupulous in exercising their social responsibilities. And then skipping down to here, the difficulty of exercising a social responsibility illustrates, of course, the great virtue of private competitive enterprise. It forces people to be responsible for their own actions and make it difficult for them to exploit other people for either selfish or unselfish purposes. They can do good, but only at their own expense. Okay, so what's interesting in these two paragraphs is that Friedman is proposing that if an executive did act on a social responsibility, then that would have pretty serious and dire consequences for the company. I mean, of course, to some extent it's true that if an executive wasn't focused on making profits, then that would have negative consequences for the company. But it's an open question whether an executive can get away with, in addition to making profits, also acting on a so-called social responsibility. Friedman here seems to be saying that it's simply not possible, but that's something we can check. We can see, have executives done this successfully without, customers and employees deserting the corporation or the stock price plummeting, and so on. Okay, then this middle paragraph that I skipped, this is mostly about inflation again, but in any case, this facet of social responsibility doctrine is brought into sharp relief when the doctrine is used to justify wage restraint by trade unions. The conflict of interest is naked and clear when union officials are asked to subordinate the interests of their members to some more general social purpose. I think I have, price and wage controls, the setting by the government of either limits on the increase of prices, including wages, or minimum prices, as in the case of a minimum wage. In the United States, price limits were imposed during World War II and in an attempt to control inflation in the early 1970s by Nixon, who later regretted doing it. If the union officials try to enforce wage restraint, the consequences is likely to be wildcat strikes, that is, strikes that are not planned by the union, rank and file revolt, and the emergence of strong competitors for their jobs. We thus have the ironic phenomenon that union leaders, at least in the U.S., have objected to government interference with the market far more consistently and courageously than have business leaders. Okay, section 3. Many a reader who has followed the argument this far may be tempted to remonstrate that it is all well and good to speak of governments having the responsibility to impose taxes and determine expenditures for such social purposes as controlling pollution or training the hardcore unemployed, but that the problems are too urgent to wait on the slow course of political processes, that is, real political processes, not what Friedman was talking about in the previous section, that the exercise of social responsibility by businessmen is a quicker and surer way to solve pressing current problems. Aside from the question of fact, I share Adam Smith's skepticism about the benefits that can be expected from those who affected to trade for the public good. This argument must be rejected on the grounds of principle. Okay, so that was what we were talking about before. What it amounts to is an assertion that those who favor the taxes and expenditures in question have failed to persuade a majority of their fellow citizens to be of like mind, and that they are seeking to attain by undemocratic procedures what they cannot attain by democratic procedures. In a free society, it is hard for good people to do good, but that is a small price to pay for making it hard for evil people to do evil, especially since one man's good is another man's evil. I have, for simplicity, concentrated on the special case of the corporate executive, except only for the brief digression on trade unions, but precisely the same argument applies to the newer phenomenon of calling upon stockholders to require corporations to exercise their social responsibility. In the recent GM crusade, for example, in most of these cases, what is in effect involved is some stockholders trying to get other stockholders or customers or employees to contribute against their will to social causes favored by the activists. Insofar as they succeed, they are again imposing taxes and spending the proceeds. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is quite right. On page 2, when Friedman talked about the executive imposing taxes and spending the proceeds, that was the executive acting on his or her own. But stockholders trying to convince other stockholders to back certain measures or try to point the company in one direction or the other is just a matter of persuasion. If they persuade them to do so, then they do. If they don't, they don't. So Friedman may or may not be right about this. The situation of the individual proprietor is somewhat different. If he acts to reduce the returns of his enterprise in order to exercise his social responsibility, he is spending his own money, not someone else's. If he wishes to spend his money on such purposes, that is his right, and I cannot see if there is any objection to his doing so. In the process, he too may impose costs on employees and customers. Okay, so for the individual proprietor, that's someone who owns a company that is not publicly traded. That is, there aren't shares, so there's no stockholders. That might be, we might think of that as, a small business that's just has one location, although it can be quite large. So, for instance, let's see, I think the Mars Corporation is a privately held company. Panera Bread is privately held, I believe. So those are cases where there aren't shareholders, even though they're pretty substantial companies. But nevertheless, there still, of course, are going to be employees and customers. However, because he is far less likely than a large corporation or union to have monopolistic power, any such side effect will tend to be minor. Okay, of course, in practice, the doctrine of social responsibility is frequently a cloak for actions that are justified on other grounds rather than a reason for those actions. Okay, so these few paragraphs here in this column are important. This notion of a cloak for actions is also important, hence the highlighting. To illustrate, it may well be in the long-run interest of a corporation that is a major employer in a small community to devote resources to providing amenities to that community or improving its government. That may make it easier to attract desirable employees. It may reduce the wage bill or lessen losses from pilferage, that is stealing, and sabotage, or have other worthwhile effects. Or it may be that given the laws about the deductibility of corporate charitable contributions, the stockholders can contribute more to charities they favor by having the corporation make the gift than by doing it themselves, since they can, in that way, contribute an amount that would otherwise have been paid as corporate taxes. In each of these and many similar cases, there is a strong temptation to rationalize these actions as an exercise of social responsibility. In the present climate of opinion, with its widespread aversion to capitalism, profits, and the soulless corporation, and so on, this is one way for a corporation to generate goodwill as a byproduct of expenditures that are entirely justified in its own self-interest. Okay, so here, what Friedman is talking about is acting on something that might look just like the social responsibilities that we were talking about down here, at the bottom of column 1 on page 2, but in these cases, the executive isn't doing it for whatever benefit it might have for society, or the community. Rather, the executive is doing it because it's going to have some benefit for the corporation. It's in the corporation's own self-interest. It would be inconsistent of me to call on corporate executives to refrain from this hypocritical window dressing because it harms the foundations of a free society. That would be to call on them to exercise a social responsibility. If our institutions and the attitudes of the public make it in their self-interest to cloak their actions in this way, I cannot summon much indignation to denounce them. At the same time, I can express admiration for those individual proprietors or owners of closely held corporations or stockholders of more broadly held corporations who disdain such tactics as approaching fraud. Okay, section 4. Whether blameworthy or not, the use of the cloak of social responsibility and the nonsense spoken in its name by influential and prestigious businessmen does clearly harm the foundations of a free society. I have been impressed time and again by the schizophrenic character of many businessmen. They are capable of being extremely farsighted and clear-headed in matters that are internal to their businesses. They are incredibly short-sighted and muddle-headed in matters that are outside their businesses but affect the possible survival of business in general. This short-sightedness is strikingly exemplified in the calls from many businessmen for wage and price guidelines or controls on income policies. Okay, again, inflation, but anyway, there is nothing that could do more in a brief period to destroy a market system and replace it by a centrally controlled system than effective government control of prices and wages. The short-sightedness is also exemplified in speeches by businessmen on social responsibility. This may gain them kudos in the short run, but it helps to strengthen the already too prevalent view that the pursuit of profits is wicked and immoral and must be curbed and controlled by external forces. Once this view is adopted, the external forces that curb the market will not be the social consciences, however highly developed, of the pontificating executives. It will be the iron fist of government bureaucrats. Here, as with price and wage controls, businessmen seem to me to revel in a suicidal impulse. The political principle that underlies the market mechanism is unanimity. Actually, consensus might be a better word there. But anyway, in an ideal free market resting on private property, no individual can coerce any other. All cooperation is voluntary. All parties to such cooperation benefit, or they need not participate. There are no social values and no social responsibilities in any sense other than the shared values and responsibilities of individuals. Society is a collection of individuals and of the various groups they voluntarily form. The political principle that underlies the political mechanism is conformity. The individual must serve more general social interest, whether that be determined by church or a dictator or a majority. The individual may have a vote and a say in what is to be done, but if he is overruled, he must conform. It is appropriate for some to require others to contribute to a general social purpose, whether they wish to or not. Okay, that's in the political realm, he's saying. Unfortunately, unanimity is not always feasible. That is, if we say consensus. There are some respects in which conformity appears to be unavoidable, so I do not see how one can avoid the use of the political mechanism altogether, that is, in the market realm. But the doctrine of social responsibility taken seriously would extend the scope of the political mechanism to every human activity. It does not differ in philosophy from the most explicitly collectivist doctrine. It differs only by professing to believe that collectivist ends can be attained without collectivist means. Okay, so collectivist here means communist, so a situation where everything is owned by the state or everything is owned by everyone, so that would be the collective. That is why in my book, Capitalism and Freedom, I have called it a fundamentally subversive doctrine in a free society, and have said that in such a society, there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources to engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. Okay, there we go.